face or anything to be in that recording, feel free to turn your camera off. But we will be recording these sessions just to make them available to those who aren't able to be here today and also moving forward. We also would ask that everyone stay muted while we are working through the presentations. Everyone does have the ability to unmute themselves, and we will be doing a Q&A after the presentations, but just in the interest of time and to make sure everyone is able to hear, we ask that you keep your devices or computers muted if you are not presenting or speaking at the time. And I will go ahead and just kick us off then. I also wanted to just do a brief acknowledgement that as government, we acknowledge that we have caused harm to some folks in our community. And we are certainly doing our best to both acknowledge that harm and minimize that as much as possible going forward. But wanted to put that out there as well. I deeply believe that we cannot move forward without recognizing and reckoning with our past. So just wanted to share that as well. Today, our topic is focused on violence prevention strategies. And our guest featured speakers are Anthony Smith, who is the Executive Director of Cities United, which is a national organization that centers reducing violence, in particular for young men and boys of African and African American descent. And then our Director of the Office of Violence Prevention here in Minneapolis, Sasha Cotton. So we welcome both of them today so that we'll go through some presentation materials to give an overview of the topic of violence prevention, and then we will have some Q&A after that. So if you have questions, please feel free to put that in the chat as we go along. If you need interpretation services, please put that in the chat as well. We do have language interpreters available today, both ASL interpreters who you should be able to already see on your screen. We also have a Somali interpreter and a Spanish interpreter available to folks who need them. All right, so with that being said, I would like to introduce Anthony Smith from Cities United and allow Anthony to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his work.
Hey, thanks, Jen. Good to see you. Good to be with you guys. Excuse me. And I know that Minneapolis and the Brooklyn Center and the communities have been going through a lot lately. And I do want to appreciate you for opening it up, acknowledging the pain, hurt, and death that the city has caused, and most cities has caused because of structural racism and just how they're set up. And that's the key step in acknowledging this and then moving forward, is that we've got to acknowledge that we have systems, structural systems that are causing this hurt and pain, and we need to correct that and move forward. Again, my name is Anthony Smith, Executive Director for Cities United. Run a network of, we support a network of mayors across the country and their teams and their communities who are really looking at how do we reimagine public safety? How do we create communities that are safe, healthy, and hopeful for young Black men and boys and their families? And how do we make sure that not only that we can keep young Black men and boys alive, but how do we create space for them to thrive and for them to be able to live out their dreams and live out their purpose and live out their vision and contribute to this country in ways that we know that they can and know that they will. So we work in partnership with mayors and their teams across the country, have been spending a lot of time in Minneapolis for, I know, at least the 5 years that I've been here. We've been a partner, but I know before that we were also a partner. Played a key role in helping set up the Next Step program with you all. Also played a key role when Mayor Hodges was there with the collaborative public safety, community collaborative public safety structure, and just have been a partner and a supporter along the way with Sasha, Jen, and Josh and the team as they work to stand up the Office for Violence Prevention and the work that it's going to do all the work that you all talked about. And I know they've been leading a lot and been pulled in a lot of directions over the last 18 months and will continue to do all the work that they can and show up and be a partner with the community and the city as they continue to build that out. But we are thankful for you all's leadership and partnership. And thankful that Minneapolis is actually pushing the conversation forward. I know it's rough and messy, but I think that's what this is going to be. We have gotten so used to current structure of public safety that it's hard to reimagine in what it could be. But those of us who live in the communities, who have families that live in the communities, who have for long been craving something different, know what a new model of public safety can look like and what it can be. And I think when you hear folks talking, you hear the conversation, listening to those who are most impacted and most at risk are where the solutions are going to come from. So there's a lot of work that has been done, a lot of work to be done. And again, we're just here to be a partner along in this journey and bring our best thoughts with you all in partnership with you all and support, and hopefully at times an ear to lean, listen to, because there's a lot to talk about. But excited to be able to have this conversation with you. I know it's been a long time coming, but again, I know the city's been busy. And the city is making steps to at least provide justice for the Floyd family. But we need system-wide justice and we need system-wide equity. So we got a lot of work to do so that we never have another George Floyd incident, and not only in Minneapolis, but in this country, which we know they continue to happen to this day. Post the verdict, we know we saw 6 more people killed at the hands of law enforcement across this country. The young girl in Columbus, and just can go down the street and name and folks and stuff like that. So we got a lot of work to do. But I think we're prepared. I think we've got a moment. And I think we need to take advantage of this moment as a country to be different and be who we say we want to be, and step into that. So I do have some slides. Am I supposed to keep going, Jen? I don't know. Yep. Okay. So I do want to just share with you all. I just want to give you all a little bit of who I am and some background of our work with you all over the last years. But I do have some slides I want to share. And I'm going to try to walk through these fast because I really do want to have a conversation with you all, and not just talk, because you can see I'm also coughing and I just want to have a conversation. It's a whole lot easier that way. So last year during the pandemic and during COVID, as you all saw, we saw homicides rise in multiple cities across this country. We also saw high profile of police murders and killings in this country, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to Dave McAtee to Tony McDade, and the names I can name on and on. And we really started thinking about, as we've been having this conversation with the community and with the country around, what does reimagining public safety look like, and how do we really move to safe, healthy, and hopeful communities? I asked my team to spend some time under the leadership of our Deputy Director, Quiniqua Carton, really just mapping out and putting together a brief for what reimagining public safety could look like, and how do we help people get there, and how do we get folks to the other side. So, and you know, part of it, and you heard me say, we are really committed to working with cities, communities, and young leaders to not only reimagine public safety, but to redefine it, right? So we've got to reimagine it, redefine it, and then that means cities and communities got to be willing to reallocate their resources to support this new model and this new vision of public safety. So we are committed to that and committed to making that happen, and partnering with as many cities across the country to really move this agenda. And as you all know, I talked about the problem. Way too many young people are living in neighborhoods that are high disadvantage and are losing their lives every day. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. Last year, we had 173 homicides. Most of those are young Black men who are dying in our streets. And that number is outrageous for a city, any city, but for a city who only has 176,000 members or residents. So when you look at those numbers, there's something happening that we need to be different about. So we know that's a problem. It's been a problem in this country, and it's remained a problem because we have not wanted to truly address the issue of racism and systemic racism, and how it causes and creates the environment for these things to happen. Another problem is that we also know that, you know, police violence often involves shootings and incidents whether the folks are killed or not killed are another part of this problem, and they can't be separated. If we truly want to create safe, healthy, and hopeful communities, we got to work on both of these at the same time, which is why we're saying let's reimagine public safety. Let's really look at what public safety is. Our model that we have today relies heavy on law enforcement, jails, and detention centers. And that keeps some folks feeling safe, but it keeps other folks feeling contained and detained and puts them in harm's way because folks see them as threats and see us as threats and see us as victims and disposable, just to be honest, as we have this conversation. I think that's what we're trying to have, an honest conversation. So really thinking through what all of that looks like and it means as you think about the two parts of this problem. One is the community violence, and then one is police and state violence. Both need to be addressed simultaneously at the same time. Both need to be looked at the root cause and understand what the root cause is. And then they both need to have strong solutions that look beyond our current model that we have in place. So when we talk about our solution, it really is, number one, we've got to interrupt the cycle of community violence. We know there are things that work today that will interrupt the cycle of community violence, and we need to put those in place. Two, we need to work hard at dismantling the systems of inequity and racism, and doing that within city government and outside of city government, because these are the things that create the environment for that cycle of violence to continue. And then two, once we understand what the new model looks like, we've got to invest in the sustainability of the operation and administrative work of that so that it can be long-term and it's not a one-time deal and here's some money, go do this for 2 years, and then we go back to the old way because we didn't give it time to work. So we got to invest heavily in those models. We got to use our local tax dollars, our county tax dollars, and our state dollars to really invest in that. And we've got to take advantage of the federal dollars that come down to support this work as well. So when we talk about let's reimagine public safety, you can see our model and our vision really is this bubble that has been created through all the hard work of the team. We have a graphic illustrator on the team, Daphne, who pulled all of the work that we talked about and put this together for us. And I'll go into details when I go to the other screens, but if you can see this, it really deals with the healing-centered engagement, making sure that we're coming at this from a healing-centered approach. That we use, what you all have with your first step, the hospital-based intervention strategy, that we use violence interruption and interrupters, those folks who know how to get in between the issues on the street and really move and get folks to some resolve so that folks can live another day. We're also talking about street outreach, which is different than violence interruption, but it's still important. Street outreach connects people to resources, and it gets people who know how to be in community and out in community out there working in partnership with folks. We also believe you got to have a coordinated crisis response team, which we'll talk more about. But this is just the model, right? So if you can move yourself from where we are today to this model, we believe and we know that we will see a different place. We will see less people dying in the streets, more families succeeding and thriving, and we'll have healthier communities where folks can thrive and live out their dreams. So you saw that was broken down. It's broken down into like 15 areas underneath each of these. So not under each of these, but under the three big buckets that I talked about. So interrupting the cycle of violence, as you can see, it's really like solutions that treats violence. I can't see my screen. I got to make sure I can see this. And the moment or within hours and days of its occurrence. So again, it goes back to making sure you have strong interruptions, violence interruption, which you guys have put in place over the last little while. That team needs to be highly supported, needs to have the right resources, but also need to have access to their own space where they can heal and reduce and decompress from the trauma that they're going to be experiencing every day. And again, the street outreach I talked about, hospital-based intervention, that's really you all know, hopefully know about your First Step project. If not, hopefully we'll drop some links in the it's Next Step, Next Step project. If we don't, you'll drop some links in the thing so that you guys can know about that. I created more diversion and alternative pathways, right? We have been a country that has been so caught up on locking folks up and throwing them away and punishment instead of saying, how do we divert those actions? How do we create alternatives so we can do some restorative justice and some healing so folks can go back and get back to their lives? Because we've all made mistakes, and if we were all punished the way we punish folks, we wouldn't, all of us would have been put in jail. I know I would have. I can't speak for all of you all. There are multiple things that I've done that if I would have allowed this current system to get a hold of me, I would not be having this conversation with you all today. And then we got to create a coordinated crisis response team. We all know people talk about homicides, shootings happen. It feels like they're happening every day. How do we respond to that? How do we as a city have a coordinated response that goes beyond law enforcement, but really looks at the street outreach works, the violence interrupters, the hospital and the intervention specialists, community members, the faith community, community-based organizations, everybody has a role to play. And how do you coordinate that response that goes beyond just the moment and the day, but it actually supports the community and the healing process over weeks at a time and builds out a space for folks to be able to engage differently, deal with the trauma that has happened in the community. Because remember, this is not just, it happened to me and my family, but it happened to me and my community. So the whole community needs to heal together. But also this last piece is around the collaborative public safety funding models, which you all done, folks in Seattle have done. This is really, how do you give resources to the community to really think about public safety differently and allow them to be part of the solution and be a part of the process. So making sure that you have those resources for that is also a key piece to this. Excuse me. Dismantling the systems of equity. We know inequity shows up in every system that we have. And we know we've got a lot of work to do in all of those systems if we really want to truly change and create safe, healthy, and hopeful communities. We need to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have a robust education that looks at them as individuals and not as the numbers, but making sure that all of our young folks not only graduate from high school, but graduate prepared for whatever they want to do, whether they want to go to college, 4-year, 2-year, whether they want to just go straight to work, whatever it is. How do we make sure all of our kids are prepared and have the educational structure that they need? This too would also need alternatives. How do we make sure we don't send every kid through the same model, because it does not work? And we need to be better at educating our whole system and all of our kids right. Expanding healing-centered engagement. This is one of the things we all got to get better at as we do programming and as we do our work. How do we how do we center healing in that process? Because there's a lot of healing, as Jen talked about when we started, that we need to do as cities, as communities, as a country, and we've got to think about that throughout. Building an inclusive economy. How do we make sure everybody can participate in these economies that we have? We know that poverty plays a role in a lot of this. And we've known for too long that which neighborhoods are behind and which ones aren't. We know where high unemployment rates are and where they're not. And we need to do better at making sure everybody can be included in this economy that we're working through. And reshaping the criminal and juvenile justice system. And again, it goes all the way back to what I talked about. It's got to be more about restorative and allowing folks to come back in community and not have that stain on them for the rest of their lives, and not just be about punitive and not be about just sending folks away for years with no training and no re-engagement strategy. We need to do better. If we're going to keep the criminal justice system, it needs to be reformed completely, and in a way where it's more about healing, restorative, and justice, and not just about punitive. And then we also got to get better at making sure that we're working with the whole family, not just the young person or the person who's in trouble, but the whole family, because my belief is that as a young person in front of you and they're in trouble, then their family's in trouble. And we have an opportunity to coordinate and better support and bolster our supports for family and making sure that they have what they need to make sure that they can take care of themselves and their kids. It's also talking about dismantling the system of equity and looking at the Goldman iceberg model. And as you can see, right, we've got to get to the place where we're just not reacting and responding, but that we're actually getting to the place where we're transforming not just the work, but our mental models. And I talked about that earlier when we start talking about public safety, the first thing that usually come to folks' mind is police, it's fire, EMT, and all of those things. Those things are keep the public safe when things are happening. But what are we doing to prevent and intervene So public safety's got to look more at the housing, at education, at employment, and the safety nets that keeps families safe, right? So thinking about how we transform and think about why things are happening, and what is the thinking and what is the impact, and not just reacting to the things that are happening, but really going upstream and saying why are they happening and changing the way we do our business. And then investing in sustainability. Again, as we think about reimagining public safety and we think about these new models and all the new things that we talked about, we've got to really start thinking about what is the true cost of public safety, and what would it take us to get to this place that we're trying to get to. There's a report that the controller out of the Philadelphia put out in 2019, Rebecca Reinhardt, and she talked about if Philadelphia invested $30,000 a year per homicide in prevention and intervention work, not only will they cut the homicide rate and down by like 35% in 5 years, they would also see a return on that investment for a number of reasons. One, they'll see housing prices go up, so they'll get resources there, but they'll also were able to see more income and taxes coming in from income. So there's a report that really talks about, let's put together a true cost. What does it cost us to keep the public safe, and what do we get in return? And if I can't get you to care about the kids whose lives that are being taken, at least I can get you to care about the dollars that we're saving. And then also we need to really assess how the city and our philanthropy and our corporate partners are spending their money to support this work, or either support it or interfere with it. So how do we make sure that we assess what's already been spent, so that we can get a clear picture of that? And then we also, as you think about this work, we've got to adopt anti-racism evaluation into our framework. We are clear that this country is racist, that this country has racist tendencies, that this country has racism throughout its systems. We've got to work to break that down. So we've got to think about how we evaluate our work. So using the anti-racism framework will help with that. And then also we've got to implement asset framing communication. We've got to talk about our young people like we give a damn about them. We got to talk about our young people like we care about them, that we want them around, that we see them, and that we want them to be a part of this conversation. We know, again, that we've all made mistakes and we've all made it to where we are. We got to give that same opportunity to our young folks. So making sure that we're real clear when we talk about our young people, that we're using asset framing around them and around their future and around what we want to see for them as they grow old and be a part of this community. So again, that's the framework. Those are the 15 pillars that fall underneath it. And we believe this is where this country needs to go and cities need to go if we're truly about reimagining public safety and really about keeping our kids safe, healthy, and hopeful. Thank you all for the space, Jen. I'm looking forward to the conversation with the team. And I'll send this to you if you want to make sure you can send it out to folks so that you'll have it as a resource.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. We're so thankful for your partnership and your guidance as well that you've been providing to us as a city for the last 5 years or more. I think it's maybe a little more than 5. And also to our surrounding cities of Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center. We all know that we don't live in a bubble here in the Twin Cities, and people move around, and it's not just things happening in Minneapolis. So we're really thankful to you and your team for all the support that you're providing to us here in the Twin Cities, even more broadly than Minneapolis. So yes, appreciate it. I think that we will get through Director Cotton's presentation and then open it up for questions. I've been pulling some, and other staff are helping me pull some from the chat that folks have been entering. So we'll go through those as soon as Sasha gets through her presentation. So next, I would like to welcome our very own Director of our Office of Violence Prevention, Ms. Sasha Cotton.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jen, thanks for the introduction. I am going to jump in with some slides and really grateful for the turnout and everyone's willingness to participate in what we think is the first of some really important conversations around reimagining public safety and thinking about it with some different lenses and opportunities. So I'm gonna quick share my screen. If I can figure it out, we're still living in this world of technology that is not always easy. Jen, I'm not seeing the platform for me to share my screen.
All right, let me send a message really quick to.
Oh, I found it. I found it. It's me. It's me. I found it. Yeah, give me just a sec here. That's what I mean. All righty. So this is an image that folks might begin to see as the Office of Violence Prevention continues to build its work and its brand. This is one of the images that we'll be using. And it really is about explaining and expressing how we see the issue, that the face of violence prevention looks like all of us. The slogan of the Office of Violence Prevention is Minneapolis Us. It takes all of us to prevent violence. And we really believe that. So this is the first of Learning Labs. This is who I am, the director of the Office of Violence Prevention. And, you know, just grounding us, transforming community safety. What do we really mean? And in Minneapolis, we are talking about developing new models of public safety that are with community and for community, and that are especially focused on ensuring that the safety of every member of our community is centered in what we are designing. When we think about our priority areas, we really tried to bucket them into 3 key pillars, and that's prevention. So breaking the cycle of violence before it begins, and that's what we're going to talk about at great length today. Oops, excuse me, sorry, I hope my screen didn't pivot too much. Okay. Alternatives, which is really thinking about what alternative kind of responses can we have when people call 911. Right now, people know that when they call 911, they might be connected to services related to law enforcement, fire, ambulatory services, but there are a number of other things that people call and may need as a service that we may be sending the wrong approach out for. And so we really want to think about, are there other resources that we could be deploying by 911? Particularly, I think right now, one of the things that's been focused on is alternatives to mental health calls, particularly those that aren't violent in nature. But we'll be continuing to build out that body of work, and that work is led by our city coordinator's office and our innovation team. And then the third bucket is really about reform and thinking about our public safety policies, certainly those policies that involve the police department, but public safety generally, and how are we showing up better around the issue of public safety for our communities in Minneapolis. And then a piece that cuts across all of that is really an effort to try to center healing and reconciliation. And so these are our goals. These are the things that we want to continue to build. There's bodies of work that exist, but by no means do we feel like we've reached our tipping point. And so we continue to build up each one of these areas. How we're developing this new model. So one of the main ways, and we're grateful for our partners from Cities United here, is by working with national organizations and looking at evidence-based, research-based programs, and really evaluating what has been shown to be effective in other cities and states across the US, as well as in other parts of the world. We recognize that the issue of public safety is something that has faced the human experience for a really long time, and that other communities have found things that have been very effective, and we want to borrow from practices that have worked well while still adding a Minneapolis specific feel to those approaches. We want to explore opportunities for structural change, recognizing, as we mentioned before, that our systems have done and caused harm, and that by changing our structures, we can mitigate and change those harmful experiences that people are having, and through community and input, community engagement and input. And so learning labs like this, the surveys that we've done, our meeting in a box opportunities that are still up on our website are really a couple of examples of how we're trying to engage with our community. Obviously with COVID and the restrictions, it's been challenging. These online platforms are not the most easy platform, but they do give us some different accessibilities from what we would have if we were solely relying on in-person meetings.
inay programyo cusub ay kusoo dejiyaan based of dhibaatadii dhacday muxuu ahaa in opportunityyaal badan waarid dadka la siiyo iyo community engagement inay dadka ka mid noqdaan dadka community-ga ah oo magaalada Minneapolis ay dirayso.
I think one of our interpreter languages lines have gotten crossed over into the mainframe, or maybe wasn't muted, but I'm going to continue on. Sorry for the interruption, and I hope that we've gotten that addressed. Our engagement principles are really focused on accessibility, meaningfulness, and inclusivity.
accessibility inuu qofka meeshuu doono uu u tegi karo haddii aad tahay.
Can one of our IT people take a look at our connection here and see if we can make some adjustments?
Yep, we're on it in the background. Give us just a minute, folks. Apologize. Give us just a second here.
No worries. Thank you. And thank you all for your patience. We apologize in advance.
But
we'll continue until we get this sorted out, and I will just pause for interpretation. So violence prevention, and in particular in Minneapolis, we are using a public health approach to breaking the cycle of violence. And what that means is much like COVID, we think of violence as a communicable disease, as something that people can catch based on their proximity to their exposure. And that with that,
it's moving me.
Like most communicable diseases, we can mitigate for people's risk, and we can also prevent people's exposures or reduce the likelihood for their exposures. So our formal definition of the public health approach is that we first focus on defining the problem. We identify risk and protective factors. We develop and test our prevention strategies, and then we assure widespread adoption. And so this is a general public health approach to prevention, and certainly the way that we try to develop the work of the Office of Violence Prevention. So factors to our approach. We think about risk and protective factors for violence. Again, I think using COVID as an example is very timely, because everyone has been thinking about this as a top of mind issue. So if we think about risk factors for COVID, we think about people who have pre-existing conditions. We think about people who aren't able to access PPE. We think about those who are working in the public and who may have greater exposure. We think about risk factors for violence through a similar lens. So people who are exposed to violence and conflict, people, particularly children who have had low parental involvement, but we know that low parental involvement can carry into adulthood behaviors. So that doesn't just apply to children, but can apply to adults later in life. Diminished economic opportunities, involvement with drugs, alcohol, or tobacco, high levels of transiency, this is a hard word for me, high levels of transiency, and low commitment to school. And again, that low commitment to school factor certainly affects our young people, but can carry us into our adulthood. So these are just a list of some of the risk factors that we know we need to be paying attention to for people as we think about their likelihood for involvement, both as a victim or a perpetrator of violence. Protective factors. So again, we know that we can think about ways to keep people safe from exposure to things like COVID by sheltering in place, by wearing a mask in public, by washing your hands frequently. Those were all things that, many of us were informed to do at the peak of the pandemic as ways to help keep ourselves safe from contracting the virus. These are some protective factors that we think of as it relates to preventing people from being involved with violence. So a commitment to school, connections to adults and or family members, positive social orientation, parental family use of constructive ways to cope with issues and problems, involvement with pro-social activities, and skills for realistic planning. So these are just, again, a few examples of protective factors that we can consider when we think about how we help people stay safe from potential exposure to violence and involvement with violence. It's important to note that risk factors do not automatically mean someone will behave violently or experience violence. And protective factors don't necessarily automatically mean that a person won't experience violence or that their behavior, won't be violent. It just simply means that we can weigh out how to best protect people and how to best identify the risk of certain individuals and groups and really target our work based on some of these risk and protective factors. But we always want to be careful that we don't use these factors to stigmatize people or be prejudicial in our approaches. We believe that violence is preventable. It is not inevitable, and like other communicable diseases, we can protect against it, we can work to prevent it, and we can treat people who have experienced violence, both as victims and perpetrators. There are many factors that go into a person's risk for being involved with violence. We recognize that violence is a complex issue. It's not simple by any means, and how people get involved with violence is not simple. Social conditions almost always matter. The way a person was raised, the environment in which they were raised, where they live, and the challenges that they're facing will often deeply impact how they'll deal with a situation and whether or not violence may in that moment feel like a reasonable option. Violence is much more complicated than just bad choices or bad people. It's much more complicated, and I think it's always very important for us to center ourselves in thinking about the choices of desperate people and how we as individuals might react if we were finding ourselves in those same situations. I often say we are all one bad decision away from being the person who is perpetrating an act of violence. And so it's important that while people be held accountable, we consider that choices matter and people's positions and their ability to make good choices really do matter. And then we also have to consider all the factors that put people at risk for or protect them from experiencing or perpetrating violence. Again, really sussing out those risk and protective factors. We recognize that violence is a cycle, and you'll hear this from us quite often, that hurt people are more likely to hurt other people. So how do we support individuals on a path towards healing and away from perpetrating violence that they've experienced? A lot of our work, as you'll hear a little bit about later, really focuses on what we call retaliatory violence, recognizing that there's sort of an innate human response when we are hurt or violated, and we often feel like either we have to retaliate or people connected to us often feel an urge to retaliate on our behalf. And we recognize that if violence stays in that circular pattern, it is very difficult to stop it. So if we can cut off the pipeline and compel people who have been hurt not to retaliate, we can improve outcomes in our community and improve safety. There are many approaches to addressing violence. Violence is multifaceted, and our solutions must be multifaceted as well. That is why our slogan is Minneapolis, and that we all have a role to play in creating safer communities. This is also important because in the public health approach, we really believe in using every tool in the toolbox. So public health is not about an either or replacing existing systems. It really is about creating an ecosystem where everyone is positioned to do their best work in keeping our communities safe. So understanding the solutions and some examples of the violence prevention work that we have in our city. We think about violence and our violence prevention work on a continuum. So you'll hear us talk about upfront strategies, which is really, I think, what most people think of when they hear prevention. They think of stopping something before it ever happens. So addressing the violence and taking approaches that will take place before the violence happens and laying groundwork that can prevent violence from emerging. So I think of this much in the same way as Anthony spoke about creating happy, healthy, hopeful communities. This is about investments in our schools, our parks, our parents, our employment system, housing, to ensure that people's basic needs are being met, because we know when those things happen, people are far less likely to be involved with violence as victims or perpetrators. The second box is focused on in the thick strategies. So these are early intervention programs that are often used to address the first sign of risk or as a response to immediate issues related to violence. So again, thinking about risk and protective factors in the thick programs really look at those communities and individuals who we can see have high risk for being involved with issues related to violence, and trying to provide them with the resources that they need to move away from the violence and towards resiliency, healing, and safety. And then the aftermath. These are responses that take place after violence has occurred. They're designed to deal with the lasting consequences of violence and to promote healing and restoration. So again, these are often called tertiary programs, but are really designed to be sort of the tip of the iceberg. Usually they impact a small number of people who have been repeatedly impacted by violence and who are often a part of that retaliatory violence that I spoke about a little earlier. This is just another metric or graph that we use in public health, and it's called a prevention pyramid. So again, primary prevention is oftentimes what people think about as prevention generally. That's stopping violence before it ever happens and really helping to build out systems that support healthy, happy, hopeful communities. The middle of the pyramid is secondary prevention. That is often what people would think of as traditional intervention. And then tertiary is really interrupting that cycle of violence and focusing on preventing further harm or injury. So Anthony referred to Next Step, which we are grateful for their support on. They helped us and were instrumental in our design of our hospital-based program. We are currently doing the Next Step program in 3 hospitals in Minneapolis, and those are HCMC, North Memorial, and newly at Abbott Northwestern. Our hospital-based program is focused on breaking the cycle of violence in partnership with hospitals. They connect they connect victims of violent injuries to resources and support right in the hospital as a bedside intervention. As I mentioned, we work in partnership with HCMC, North Memorial, and Abbott Northwestern. And program staff provide an immediate bedside support for participants and their families. And they also provide long-term community-based follow-up for participants who want further support with changing their lives and stopping the cycle of violence. This is really important because, again, we know that that cycle of violence and retaliation is such a high contributing factor to the violence that we see in our communities. And if we can get out in front of that retaliation, we can make a real difference. Nationally, about 40% of individuals who come into hospitals with an injury from violence will return with a same or similar injury in that first year. And what we've experienced with our work at Next Step is that that number is roughly under 10% for those who go through our Next Step program. So we do believe that programs like Next Step have a significant impact on those who opt into services and who are able to get support not only immediately in the hospital, but long-term around housing, employment, education, mental health, and other supports that help put them on a trajectory towards safety. Project Life, also known as the Group Violence Intervention, is another program of ours that's focused on that tertiary group, those who are experiencing cycles of violence. Project Life is a replication of the Group Violence Intervention, which is a national model that's sanctioned by the Department of Justice. It focuses on delivering an anti-violence message to active to provide pathways to exit the cycle of violence, and is eligible right now to group and gang individuals who are over 18. We are in the process right now of developing a juvenile version of this in response to the significant upticks that we've seen in juvenile violence over the last year or so. The program provides case management, individual development, referrals, advocacy, and coaching. But I think one of the things that's, as well as basic needs assistance, but one of the things that makes GVI very unique is that most of the staff that work on the group violence intervention are individuals who have done the heavy lift of changing their own lives. Most of them are former gang members themselves or have their own experience with a group dynamic and have done the heavy work of changing themselves and can be really instrumental in helping young people and individuals in that system, in that dynamic, understand that change is possible and that having a positive, healthy lifestyle is a real goal that they can focus on. Project Life's local version, like I said, of the group violence intervention, and it is a partnership between our community, social services, and law enforcement. It addresses the action of gangs and groups, and it particularly focuses not just on group members, but really on those who are most likely to be involved in gun violence. What the data says to us is that while only a small percentage of people in our whole society are involved in gangs, an even smaller percentage of them are active shooters. And the group violence intervention is really narrowly focused on that population who is believed to be at high risk for being the next shooter or victim of gun violence. It gives authentic, incredible offers of support for people who are ready to make change. And sometimes that change can look as significant as full-on relocation. And so sometimes we recognize that people need an out that is very realistic. And so through the network of GVI providers across the country, we are often able, when necessary, to help people relocate, if necessary, away from Minneapolis to help them find what we call a place where they can be safe, alive, and free. And those are really the pillars of GVI, is helping people to stay safe, alive, and free. GVI has been implemented in Minneapolis since 2017. We use 2016 as a year to compare to. When we look at our highlight months, which is our summer months, May through September, the year before we implemented, according to MPD data, we had 93 group member involved shootings. When we implemented GVI in 2017, we saw those numbers dramatically reduced down to 42 group member involved shootings. In 2018, we saw those numbers reduced down to 25. In 2019 to 27. So a little bit of a bump up, but not numerically significant. And we're still waiting on the calculations from MPD for 2020, although we all know that 2020 was a very challenging year. And we know that those numbers, unfortunately, will likely be a little higher. Due to COVID, we weren't able to do our work under the way that we normally would, although our case managers and outreach staff continued to do engagement with clients. It looked dramatically different with COVID restrictions in 2020. And we think that that certainly played a role in some of the increases that we unfortunately saw in 2020. Lastly, the Minneapolis Strategic Outreach Initiative, which is modeled after Cure Violence and an interrupter model that Anthony spoke a little bit about in his presentation, is a new model for us in Minneapolis that we piloted in 2020. The Minneapolis strategic outreach teams have a mix of interrupters and outreach workers who are trusted community members who use informal mediation and de-escalation to calm violence. The pilot launched in Minneapolis in the fall of 2020. It was a timely, visible, positive, and peaceful presence in community to help reduce concerns around violence. And right now we're using expert technical assistance from Cure Violence Global to launch our next full-on implementation, which will start its work in late May or early June of 2021. So we're very excited about the full implementation of this project. We know it's been a long time coming in Minneapolis, and we're excited about having very visible and concentrated outreach and support services for people who are involved with violence who want to find transitions out of that lifestyle and to find safety. Some of our community-driven strategies for violence prevention include our Violence Prevention Fund. We're going to be releasing the names of agencies that have been selected, but Anthony talked a little bit about community-driven collaborative public safety strategies, and this is sort of the offshoot of that work and is really designed to pour resources into the brilliance that we know exists in Minneapolis as community-based organizations, individuals, faith-based organizations, and educational resources. And so in 2019, we funded 10 agencies with up to $325,000 total. So that was cutting across all of various organizations. Of those organizations, they hosted over 100 events and engaged over 7,000 people. They served over almost 6,000 meals and provided stipends and meaningful skill training for 44 young people. And that is our last slide, which gives us some time to take some questions. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen White and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Oh, forgive me here, my printer going. Thank you so much for that, Director Cotton and Anthony. We have been monitoring the chat, and there's been a lot of questions that have popped up throughout the presentations. So if you do have additional questions, feel free to just throw those in the chat. Director Cotton, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
I'm trying.
Oh, okay, you're trying. I'm sorry, I missed you saying that.
No, it's okay. Give me just a second. I'm still having some
Sure.
technical difficulties, but I think I'll get it figured out in just a second here.
No worries. And so while she is working on getting that off the screen there, I also did want to mention one other initiative that we have in the Office of Violence Prevention that there was not a slide for, but I think is a really important initiative, and that is our Blueprint Approved Institute. And what that work does is that it provides micro grants and training and support to groups and organizations who have really great ideas about how to work within their own communities around violence prevention, but may not have had the technical expertise or experience to learn how to write grants and do evaluations and things like that. So that initiative provides micro grants of $6,000, and then those folks are entered into a cohort together. and then get that additional training and support. And then they're also able to implement their projects. And I know this was one of Director Cotton's initiatives that she started, recognizing that, people know their own communities best, and know what maybe some of the gaps are and what's needed, and just at times maybe need a little bit of support. And that initiative has been extremely successful for the years that it's been going on. And we've got a cohort working right now as well. All right, so if it's all right, we will switch over to some of the questions, and I'm just noting the time. We've got about 30 minutes left, so I think we can get through a good deal of these. So one of the first questions that came up is around the community violence, and this was from Stephanie. As a city, we are seeing horrible incidents of our young people being shot. Recently, a 10-year-old. What can we do today to keep our young people safe? And I think that can be probably both Director Cotton and Anthony. Either one of you or both of you could take that question.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I think at the end of the day, we've got to be able to, as Sasha and others talked about, get those folks on the ground who know how to get to the people with the guns. Because I don't believe the 10-year-old was the intended victim. It was probably caught in a crossfire, but somebody was an intended victim. So making sure that somebody can, because what interrupters and folks who do the interruption work do, they understand both sides. They know the would-be perpetrator and the would-be victim and know how to get in there and squash that beef. So if you could get more of those folks on the street, they would be extremely helpful. Also, as we're going into the summer months, making sure, and I know the team is working on this as well, that there's opportunity for young people to go to work. We got to give folks opportunities, right? Right now, young people who are in this life and doing this work, do not have opportunities that the rest of their peers and other folks do. So we've got to be real clear to identify those most at risk of being the victim of the perpetrator and get them involved in some healing work, some real work where they can make some money, and then get them in programming. Because, we also know that one of the things that we haven't talked about is there's a program called Advanced Peace that started out in Richmond, California, that really focused in on the shooters and put them into a 18-month fellowship, was paid for 9 months as they completed stuff. But they saw a 70% reduction in their homicides. So we just got to be clear about who we're talking about. And we got to get to those folks while we're also, again, dismantling those systems that continue to create this environment for the cycle to continue, right? So making sure that Sasha and Jen and the team have what they need to really do their work while we're also doing the other upstream work is going to be key and important. But making sure that we're just focusing in on the people who are most at risk. We cannot spread ourselves so thin that this is about everybody, because there's got to be really, really clear. We know these folks are folks who are in trouble and they need resources now and help now. And we cannot be caught up in not giving them jobs, not giving them resources because because they're not doing all the right things. They're not doing all the right things because we're not giving them a chance in the first place. So I think that's how we get to those who are causing harm and who are in harm's way now, so that no other 10-year-old gets shot this summer.
Yeah, Anthony, I think you made some really good points. That circular reasoning of not, working with that target demographic. And I think oftentimes having such rigid restrictions that sometimes they jump out of our programs because we make it so hard for them to be successful is a huge part of it. I also think one of the things we're focused on in the OBP as we expand is that whole family dynamic. So how are we working with entire families? A lot of programs are very nuclearly focused on just the one individual. And, as we build out our models here in Minneapolis, really trying to look at if we intake, the dad or the brother into a program, that we're looking at every member of that family and finding ways to resource them, because we know that will also be really important as we mitigate risk and protective factors, because 10-year-olds being shot is just simply unacceptable. And we have to do more and better in order to address it.
Thank you both for that. And it really does take, looking at just beyond the individual, but, really the whole family, because it's a community, and also lifestyle is a part of all of this as well. Our next question is around group and gang violence. So how does the group, I'm assuming the violence prevention portfolio, address the current gang violence that has led to so many shootings? And who coordinates all of the groups?
Sorry, I was on mute there. So I think the goal of an Office of Violence Prevention is to really be the place where a lot of that work can be anchored. And I think one of the challenges that we've had here in Minneapolis is that some of our work started before our office was developed. And so we're still really working hard to arrange how all of this work is situated within the city. So we've got programs that cut across our city, and many of them are in the office. And so right before this meeting, I left what we call our custom coordination meeting, which is several of our departments and divisions and community partners who are meeting on a weekly basis to talk about the violence and to try to come up with joint solutions that help us to address safety in our community. But it is no easy feat. And that's also got a lot to do with data sharing. So as we really try to think about how we think through systems change, data sharing becomes one of those really important factors, because we know oftentimes those who are at high risk are the population that are consistently having engagement with law enforcement. But if our OVP and our police department aren't in a position to share data because of data privacy acts, then it makes it very difficult for us to be able to provide the robust services that we'd like to provide to those individuals at greatest need. So I think that's one of the challenges, but we are definitely working on and continuing to work together, and share the data that we can share in order to serve our communities well.
Thank you. The next one I think would be maybe great for Anthony to take on, because I think it's a little broader in systems. Why is there so much resistance to get, such programs going, and I guess maybe resistance out of the system overall?
Yeah, it goes back to this ideal of what public safety is and what we're willing to spend our resources on. These programs make us look at perpetrators differently, look at perpetrators as they can be reformed, as they can be a part of society. And this country and cities have been so stuck on one way of justice that we're not open to new ways. So when you come with folks with new programming and new ideas, one, they want to see what's the data, show us that it works. Nobody asked that same data about the police department, right? We ask for data about police, but we don't hold them accountable to it. These new models work and they've been practiced, they are evidence-based, but people are still skeptical of them because it's not the ideal model that we have. So part of this reimagine is helping people see that there's a new way, right? You all got tons of data on Next Step that tells us that the young people who showed up, where they moved to, how they got better in life, how things are different for them. They have not showed back up into the hospital with another wound. There was no retaliation from that. But that, for some reason, is hard for people to understand and see, because it feels like you are coddling or you are making it okay when it's not saying it's okay. It really is saying a mistake was made. We can heal from this. Let us walk through the healing process. So it's just a new model, and it's a new way of doing business that is hard for people to get behind. And then part of that, just to be honest, Jen, is that it's because of the population that we're talking about too. This is mostly Black and brown folks that we're talking about. And this country is not used to giving second chances, sometimes first chances or second chances, let alone to folks who they believe have committed crimes that are egregious. And that they can't be redeemed from. So I think the hard part of this conversation really is that we got to deal with our systemic racism and the root causes so that people can see a new day. I think the folks who are showing up for these calls understand that there's a new way and new models and are looking for ideas, but I don't think that's not the norm yet. I think we're getting there. I think we have an opportunity to get there, but I do think one of the things that folks on this call should really be doing is looking at the Next Step data, the GBI data that you all have, and because it shows that it works. And it shows that it's saving lives, and it shows that it's not only stopping people from dying, but it's helping those who were involved in the lifestyle start to thrive and find new opportunities and new resources. So I just think people got to want to look differently and look under the lens different. But again, it's just it goes back to that iceberg that we put up. It's just we got to change our mental models and change the way we think about what public safety really is and who actually deserves second, third, and fourth chances. And that's just going to be hard for the country to grapple with.
Yeah, I would concur. And I also think it's important for us to think about how systems are structured and how our programming really pushes back against how we've been conditioned to believe public safety works. If public safety is purely focused on punitive measures, then we know we'll just continue to see people return to incarceration, right? Because we're not really solving the problem when we incarcerate people, we're just punishing them. What we're seeing in our program, particularly in the group violence intervention or Project Life, is we maintain an open door policy, recognizing that people's lives go through ebbs and flows. We saw lots of people during COVID who had never struggled before lose their jobs, deal with, sort of chronic depression from being isolated. And that was mainstream society, people who were traditionally completely pro-social, who still needed a lot of additional support to do well. And for those who are already on the cusp or already struggling, what do we think happened with those people? And what we know is that for our group violence intervention clients, because we do keep an open door policy, is that we saw a number of them who had got on very successful trajectories, who felt like they got bumped off track because of COVID and because of that struggle. And because our door was open, they were able to come back and receive services and tap back in and say, I am really on the cusp of making some bad choices that would put me in a dangerous situation. And I know I don't want to do that, but I'm feeling like I don't have a lot of choices. And the choice that they had was to contact their support and outreach team member, right? And if we overprogram people, if we say, oh, well, you're only able to be in this program for 6 months or 9 months or 12 months, and then you're done, or you can only come if you've been referred by probation or the police, because GVI does have a self-referral aspect. So people can opt in because they've heard about it through community networks and they need the service. We've got to continue to make those kinds of opportunities available so that people, when they're struggling, have a place to go and that they can get the support that they need in order to get back on track. We really try to think about many of our programs like an extended family network. You have to come right, like when you show up at a relative's house and you're asking for help, you've got to come correct, but you can always come back. And that's got to be built into more of our programs and our systems, and not just waiting until people fall off the edge before we offer them a lifeline.
Thank you for that response. The next one is really, or the next two, I'm going to kind of combine them together because I think they're related. But what strategies are being taken to address community involvement at the city level? The city can do a better job of investing in communities that serve populations that are culturally responsive to their needs. And what is being done in the community to implement these strategies? What boots have you put on the ground and how are they performing?
So I'm going to ask you to repeat the first part of the question because it was lengthy and I just want to make sure that I answered it in totality.
Sure. Yep. And apologize. So it was kind of more of a statement, but saying that, the city can do a better job of investing in communities, in particular, those that serve populations that are culturally responsive to their needs, so culturally specific groups and organizations to meet the needs of their own communities. And then what boots on the ground have you put out there and how are they performing?
So I think one of the best examples that we in the Office of Violence Prevention can offer related to this is the community patrols that were designed to support community during the trial of former officer Derek Chauvin. And so we were able to fund 7 organizations, all of them being culturally specific or culturally relevant organizations, to work in and with community around peacekeeping, de-escalation, and trauma and healing as a result of the trial. We know that the trial created a lot of stress and tension for community, both in anticipation of what might happen, but also just sort of living through the trauma of being such a high profile incident and having the spotlight on our city, just it invoked a lot of stress, and particularly for communities of color, the high profile nature of law enforcement and military in our communities were also very traumatizing. And so some of our groups did trauma and healing circles within communities. Some of them did them on Zoom. We had organizations that were working with mosques and really talking about, sort of the trauma and needs in that specific community. We had folks working in our American Indian community who were really focused on healing and smudging and other, native practices that help people deal with and cope with trauma and stress. And so that's just one very small example of how we're thinking about those things in the Office of Violence Prevention. But I agree that overall, as a city, we do need to continue to make deeper investments, both financially and just sort of philosophically, in ways that we partner with our communities that are most vulnerable, and be sort of unapologetic about saying that when we serve the least of these, those who are not receiving, that the rest of our communities benefit from that as well. So really working to address those who are, socially mistreated and untreated in order to elevate their needs, and recognizing that that's not an equitable approach, but really is about meeting the needs of our entire community.
Thank you for that. And this one is for Anthony. Are there particular actions we can take to help heal the wound of the state-sponsored violence in our community? And I think that needless to say, as we were, getting the verdict or nearing the verdict of Derek Chauvin, and then we had the officer involved in Brooklyn Center of the young man Dante Wright, where it's kind of layers upon layers, and then also other incidents happening in other cities across the country that we all feel as well. So really, just acknowledging the cumulative impact of that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I consistently have to say to mayors and other folks across the country, is that it's not just George Floyd, it's all of the ones who have passed before and since. And it's so different from Black folks and brown folks, because that could be any of us or any of our people. And it doesn't seem disconnected at all, right? So making sure that people just understand that the trauma that we have dealt with for the 400 years on this country is the continuation when we see somebody die at the hands of a police officer like that, right? That's the same thing you saw in Jim Crow. That's the same thing you saw on the slave patrols. That's the same thing that you saw, as folks were being hung and stuff. So that was just the lynching. And that's the history of this country. And when it happens, it breaks lots of trust that was trying to be built, right? Because I think we have been, as a people and as people of color, been trying to trust this city, this country for a long time. And then incidents like that happen back to back, and it breaks that trust. So one, folks who are not of those races, or folks who the majority are white folks, need to be able to recognize that. That's a starting point. And to give folks space to heal and understand, because Breonna impacted you all just as much. Breonna impacted me here in Louisville. George Floyd impacted me here in Louisville just as much as it impacted you all at home. So when I'm doing this work and I hear of somebody dying at the hands of law enforcement, it disrupts my whole day. But folks expect me to show up the same way and produce and be ready to do all of this work. So just taking some of that into consideration is one. I actually shared the document that we created around police-involved shootings and in-custody deaths. And it walks through a number of things that people can do to start the healing process, just creating safe spaces for people to be. If you can give people time off, if you can give people time to step away, but just been understanding of the impact that it has on Black and brown people, excuse me, when those incidents happen. And I'll be 100%. When I worked inside of city government here in Louisville, it's even harder for folks who work inside of city government, to have to get up every day and go into a system that it knows that just killed somebody that looks like them, but we still got to go and do this work. So just being real clear, people, that people need space to heal. People need space to process, but people don't want to have to be the one that explains all of this to folks all the time either. So creating those kind of spaces is important, but then also the faith community opening up their spaces for people to come in and heal, people to come in and just be. Nothing has to be super programmed. It just got to be spaces where people know that they can come in and heal. And I also think cities got to do a better job at allowing folks to protest in a way that works for them and not try to barricade that and control that and militarize that in a way that shows, again, that we care more about property than we do about y'all, right? So there's a lot of stuff that goes in there. So it's a hard one to answer, but it's just really about recognizing the trauma and the hurt and the pain that connects to 400 years of, and not just an incident, and that it impacts Black and brown folks in ways that I don't think folks will ever understand as we do this work and we try to heal in this work. So giving us that space, I think is gonna be important. But I'll always ask the faith community and community-based organizations that are trusted, just open your space and let people be, provide food, provide space, and just give them space to talk. And when we talk about protests, I get so tired of people saying it's got to be peaceful protests. That's what it mostly is, until it's not, when police come with their riot gear and all of that stuff. So when folks hit the streets, that's what they're hitting the streets for, to be peaceful and to be and show their anger, but they're not going to burn down buildings and tear up stuff. All of that stuff happens at the other incidents. And then there's also some folks who just come to do that, and they're not part of the movement. And we just got to be clear that that's who they are. And you all need to focus on getting them out of the way and allow folks who are grieving to grieve and protest, because we continually get it wrong. And in Minneapolis and in Louisville, when you bring in the National Guard and when you barricade cities and you tell people from certain communities they can't maneuver, you're saying to them again, your hurt and frustration don't matter. And we are really here to protect this property and these white folks and not you. So I don't know if that answered the question, but check out the guide that I put in the box. It's probably got a whole lot more helpful tools than I just said, but that's what came to me as we were talking.
Anthony, if I can just chime in, I think that the statement about making space for Black and brown city staff is such an important part of the conversation. And I don't often get too deep into my personal life on these kinds of things, but the week prior to Daunte Wright's murder, my son had a stop like that in a suburban district. Very similar in the cause of the stop, a broken taillight with his girlfriend, called me. I can hear the conversation happening in the backdrop. And the gift, this is why this conversation is not either or. The gift in all of it is that as the officer was questioning my son and I'm listening to it, my son had the language and the officer had the hearing. My son said, hey man, with everything going on in the world, I'm just scared. I'm just really scared, because this was right around the time that the verdict was coming down for George Floyd's murder. And I'm very grateful that that white officer took a moment to hear that and to acknowledge that the squirreliness he was seeing and the fear he was seeing was just a legitimate Black young man who was scared, and not him trying to evade or, he's a college student. He's not creating chaos, right? But I just think it's important to personalize how, and I had to show up for work the next day, right? And I had to do the funeral for Daunte Wright with his mother, right? So these things are real, and the dichotomy of Black and brown bodies who work in government, who work on these issues, are very real. And so I just wanted to point that out because it isn't often said. And I think it's important to highlight, not only for myself, but for the staff who work on these things across the country every day.
Thank you both for that. And it also speaks to some of the coaching that I've experienced, been grateful to experience with Resmaa Menakem, about how unsettled our nervous systems are. and that trauma shows up in our bodies physically, in all of us, not just us as Black-bodied individuals, and that is very much intergenerational, and it is passed along. While we are on the topic of healing and community healing efforts, there was a question in the chat about the city's involvement or investment or lack thereof in community healing efforts since last year, last summer's uprising. And I think that a lot of times as a city entity, we don't do a great job of talking about the work or the groups that we're partnering with or funding. So one of the, I wanted to just address that. There was today in the Public Health and Safety Committee meeting, several organizations who the Office of Violence Prevention is funding through the Violence Prevention Fund, and that was approved today. And I just want to mention a couple of them that are related to healing and outside of maybe traditional kind of yoga or meditation, which was another comment that was in the chat. What besides that is happening? There is an organization.
Sabes, puedo ayudarte.
Oh, sorry, if you're not speaking, can you mute yourself? Thank you.
Hi, I took over for Chavez for interpreting. This is Maria.
Okay, Maria, we will just have to have our tech try to assign you as an interpreter. Can you just hold on for 1 second here? There's a certain button that you have to.
Okay.
Thanks. I'm just sending him a message really quickly. Appreciate everyone's patience.
I'll jump in while Jen is doing that tech work. And while I don't have the list of OVP fund agencies that were funded, I think a bit of the point is that there are some things happening. One of which is that Next Step does offer a trauma group. It wasn't a part of the original model, but over time we've realized that supportive services, not only for those who are enrolled in the Next Step program, but for those who just have had experiences with violence.
Que tienes experiencia con los virus es muy importante.
I think twice a month basis.
Dos veces al mes.
Work with people who have been impacted by violence, which we think is really important. And those are open to the public, anyone who has had an experience with violence. So whether that's them as a perpetrator, victim, witness, or loved one, can receive some supportive services through that opportunity. And then Jen, I don't know if you're ready to jump back in with OVP fund programs.
Yep, thank you. And I think we're all set with Maria as well. So appreciate that. So I just wanted to mention a couple that we are funding now that passed today in committee. SIWA, AIFW, and they will be offering healing workshops, storytelling circles, and 2 community events focused on South Asian immigrants. Fumalani, Minnesota African women will host monthly healing circles for African immigrant and refugee families living in Minneapolis. Letitia Carter will be holding 10 healing circle gathering sessions for African American women, healing from the intersectional impact of community violence, children affected by gun and gang and group violence, and their own experience of intimate partner violence. And then lastly, Kente Circle will host a conference designed to provide space and support for Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, and other communities of color professionals who are working in mental health, education, social work, juvenile justice, and corrections to engage with community, nonprofit, and faith leaders in professional development and thoughtful community building. And I think that speaks to a level of kind of secondary trauma from folks who are engaged in this work and and what we experience as well. And those are just a few. We can share a link to those, to that staff report from the committee meeting as well with all of you. So just wanted to take note of that, we really value work that's happening in community, and particularly around healing, because we know that, we've had a very tumultuous year, but a lot of this is ongoing anyways. So wanted to add that as well. I think we've got maybe time for one more question. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we're coming up on 4:30, and there was one in particular that I think that speaks to something that is kind of coming up around the charter question. So this is a hypothetical for Sasha. Can you discuss the potential advantages and disadvantages of violence prevention work being in the same department as the police and other public safety efforts, as opposed to being in the health department as we are currently situated?
Yeah, so I think that as we think about reimagining public safety, we have to keep all of our options on the table. And that is definitely at the heart of a public health approach. And so one thing that I will, as long as I'm the director of the Office of Violence Prevention, I will always want to center the public health approach. And really that's because it's rooted in research and theory, but also because it's been shown to be effective. And it really taps into using every tool in the toolbox, as I had mentioned before. And so we really try to be clear that our methods are not about an either or. It's not about non-enforcement strategies or enforcement strategies in isolation. It really is about looking at the spectrum of how we keep communities safe and recognizing that we all have a role to play and that we're not going to eliminate existing systems overnight, but that we have to really reinvest in thinking about what works. And even the things that we've been holding on to that we think work, evaluating their effectiveness, or are they just our crutch and we're comfortable with them? And so to me, any system that allows us to do a better job of integrating a full ecosystem that would allow us to have better data sharing. So if that means being anchored under one department, I think could be a positive. I think anytime you make big governmental structural change, you have to be very intentional. And so I think the process that our council and our mayor and other elected officials are taking to really try to look at all of the potential ways to do this well, and also giving people choice, right? So putting this on the ballot versus just trying to do some sweeping decision-making, I think are all really important things to think about. But for us as an enterprise right now, we have work that's anchored across various departments, and that does provide some really rigorous challenges. And so I think any system that creates an opportunity for us to work better together is great. I often use this analogy about clinics. I don't know, my grandmothers are both in their early 90s, and I'm blessed to still have both of them. But when they get sick, they say they're going to the doctor. And in actuality, what they're doing is going to a clinic. They're going to see a medical receptionist when they get there. They're going to have someone who comes and takes them back. That's likely an MA. If they need blood work, they're going to see a phlebotomist. They might see a nutritionist. They might spend all of 5 minutes with a doctor, if they even see a doctor while they're there, but they're experiencing medical care at each juncture. And I think that that's, whether we put it in a new department or we build those systems out in existing departments, that's really what our goal has to be as we reimagine public safety, is to really position people to do their best work and not ask people to do things that fall outside of their skill set, which is what we've been doing. We have really overtapped law enforcement in our society. We've doubled down on calling 911, and we need to really think about who is best appropriate as a response when you call 911, because much like a phlebotomist, I would much rather have them draw my blood than a doctor. Even though a doctor has had many years of medical training, phlebotomists do that work every single day. They know how to get the veins to pop and how to make it all work. And the same is true in our public safety systems. Conflict resolution, de-escalation, those are skill sets that interrupters work on every single day, and they're really good at it. And they may be better at de-escalating than other people who are professionals in public safety. And so we want to position people to be successful and to keep our communities safe. And I think that's what we need to be evaluating, how we get a system that does that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I know we're running up on time here, just a little bit over. So just really quickly, I wanted to thank you all for spending your time with us this afternoon and engaging with us on these important topics. I want to give a special thanks to our featured guest, Anthony Smith from Cities United, for all the work that you do here in Minneapolis and for cities across the country. And I also wanted to thank our director, Sasha Cotton, here in Minneapolis, doing the work day in and day out on the ground here. And really to thank all of you, our community it really does take all of us to prevent violence and to work together to create the safe community that we all know that we all want and can be together. So just want to thank all of you. I did add the community safety email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out with any additional questions, or if you'd like to be added to our list for updates. We will be having future Learning Lab opportunities, and we will be sharing those on our webpage. This video will be made available on our webpage as well. And in the meantime, thank you all and be safe.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.